I wanted to talk to you about something that truly is on my mind all the time. And that is, there was, in the last session, one of the speakers talked about museums as safe places for difficult content. And that's a phrase that we use often at the 9/11 Memorial Museum, that this is a safe space to re-encounter very troubling, traumatic history. And that's true, but there are so many landmines, if you will, in the territory that we occupy, metaphorically speaking, that every decision we make has to be thought through in a million different ways. And this was a process that we did in creating the museum. We really had to look at everything from every angle. How would this decision be received by family members of victims? How would it be received by the first response community? What would the public think if we did this? Everything was charged. And we've opened, as you know, we're now 16 months in operation, and we've had 3.6 million people come through our doors in 16 months. And generally speaking, the response has been extremely supportive and extremely favorable. So you would think, okay, we have nothing left to worry about. But it's not true, because now we're at the operational stage of this organization. We were for a very long time in what I would call the entrepreneurial phase, where we were imagining the museum and building the exhibits and thinking through what the content would be and imagining and anticipating the visitors' emotional experiences, the sequence of their affective experience in the museum. And then one day, I walked in the museum and the renderings came to life. And I will say that, the first few days after we opened, I constantly had the feeling, it was like, what are all these people doing in my museum? Because it was my space for so long, it was in my head, and then it was empty of people for so long. And then suddenly the public comes in and they own the space, all the things you thought they would do in the space, the places you think they would go first. They don't, the public, the audience, visitors do what they will, and you now have to accommodate to them. And that's a whole different phase of operation. But we're now looking at the museum not just as a presenting organization, an educational environment that people are moving through, this quasi-archaeological, quasi-commemorative, quasi-historical institution. We are now an educational institution. We have begun our public program series. We have two scholars coming in this fall to begin doing research and hopefully publishing out of our collections. We've begun a robust series of programs with the schools in the greater New York City metropolitan area. And when you are a museum documenting traumatic content, traumatic history, particularly when the museum is located at the site of the atrocity. The charged nature of the physical place that you're at conditions the choices you make about what is and what is not appropriate. So for example, and I've been back and forth on email while I've been here about this, I have a wonderful vice president of education. He is just terrific, Clifford Shannon. And he proposed last week doing a program with a scholar, a professor in California, who is the only individual who has listened to every one of the audio tapes that were confiscated out of Osama bin Laden's caves in Tora Bora. And he's gone through all of them, he's cataloged them, he's now published a book in England about the content of these tapes. And it's revealing of many things, what actually the ideology was that he was espousing, his charismatic delivery, because many of these are recordings of lectures and presentations he gave to adherents of Al-Qaeda. It's fascinating stuff if you're in the business of wanting to understand the mindset of the perpetrator, which certainly is consistent with what we want to do as an educational institution. We need to understand what the perpetrator was thinking so we can understand the event in historical context. So we're thinking, okay, this, we just have to kind of frame it correctly. This is not a celebration of Osama bin Laden's speeches. It's a way in to understanding the issues and the ideas that were at the heart of the Al-Qaeda organization leading to, or actually after the fact of 9/11. And then I get an email here in Buenos Aires that, oh, and by the way, we just found out that this professor has also written a book on the poetry being written by the individuals being held at Guantanamo. And this is a whole field of study. The individuals being held at Guantanamo include Khaled Sheikh Mohammed, who was the mastermind of 9/11. He was also the uncle of Ramzi Youssef, who was the mastermind of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. These are the co-conspirators of the 9/11 attack in some cases, people very involved in the money transfers. They are the perpetrator organization beyond the hijackers. And he's written a book about essentially jihadist poetry. But again, academically speaking, that's interesting. There's a whole field of study now about jihadi poetry. It is a way that jihadists promote their ideas. It legitimates their ideas because verse, in particular verse in a certain kind of meter, is centuries old, and it is very valued in Muslim society because it is the way that many of the great thinkers of Islam communicated to their followers over time. So there's a legitimacy to it in the minds of those who are reading and hearing this poetry. It's very lyrical poetry. It is romantic in the academically conventional sense of the word. And for a literature professor to be writing about jihadist poetry, fine and dandy. To present jihadist poetry at the 9/11 Museum, where we also have a repository of remains of the victims, which is a whole other topic, but because of the way 9/11 happened, because of the collapse of the two towers, and I don't mean to be too graphic, but human beings were pulverized. And there are literally thousands of human remains that were recovered from the site that are in the custody of the medical examiner of the city of New York, the chief medical examiner, that have not been able to be identified using current DNA analysis because the remains are so degraded from the collapse and the destruction. Well, the medical examiner in perpetuity has committed to using increasingly precise DNA analysis to try to make positive identifications. And every once in a while, you'll read in the New York newspapers a positive identification has been made and remains still 14 years later have been returned to family members. Well, right now, 40% of the families who lost loved ones on 9/11 in New York have received nothing of their loved ones, nothing. So the memorial itself is a kind of quasi-cemetery for these people. It's where they can go. They haven't had the ritual of burial. They have not had that sense of conclusion. Because of a promise made to a coalition of family members back in 2003 by the then New York State Governor Pataki, the repository of remains maintained by the New York City medical examiner had to be housed at the World Trade Center site, and at the request of these families needed to be within they called it within the embrace of the slurry wall. Well, as you were at my lecture yesterday, you know the slurry wall is 7 stories below ground where it's visible. It's part of the foundation of the World Trade Center. And the families had one other requirement, which was that that repository be situated in between, but not on either one of the tower footprints, because they did not want to privilege one group of victims over the other. There's only one place in the museum footprint that meets all of those requirements, within the slurry wall, not on either footprint, and it is literally the first place visitors come to when they reach bedrock, when they get 7 stories below ground. And it is not part of the museum. It's behind a wall. It's the wall, if you've seen the pictures of the Spencer Finch artwork and the Virgil quote, this huge work of art of nearly 3,000 individual watercolor squares. Behind that is the wall that contains the room that you know, has these remains that are maintained by the medical examiner. I don't even have a key to get in there. It's not our property, it's the city property. However, in the lived experience of a visitor to this museum, for all intents and purposes, there's only a membrane, a boundary that separates you, the visitor, from the repository of remains. So the remains are present either physically, symbolically, metaphorically, or simply in your consciousness. They are there. So what you choose to do, what exhibit topics we'll take on for our special exhibitions going forward, the programs that we do, all have to be looked at through this filter of what's appropriate at this place. And it's difficult because you want to come out of the gate, educationally speaking, robust and presenting programs that are really important and really of the moment. And where else are we looking at subjects like the jihadist poetry at Guantanamo, or how poetry is even used by ISIS right now as part of its recruitment strategy? It's important that we become literate in the West about ISIS, or else we're going to be surprised again in a very bad way, in the way we were all surprised by 9/11. So that's a tension that we're constantly negotiating, and that's very much on my mind. The only other thing I wanted to say, and then I do want to leave some time for questions. I know, you know, sometimes things come up that are on my mind that I don't even know are on my mind, and you'll make me aware of that, is that there is a real tension between building a museum and then operating a museum. So all of the things that we considered, and actually Jeanette's question in the last session about what do we do to handle the emotion of our visitors, oh my God, that was in every single design discussion in the creation of this museum. We had our designers design tissue boxes that could be placed at certain strategic points in the pathway of the visitor. We do have to constantly replenish the tissues. We built in what we called emotional exits into the historical exhibition, so that it's not a forced march. You don't have to go from beginning to end. You can leave when you're ready to leave. And that was a strategy we employed throughout that part of the museum, so that if a visitor is overwhelmed, they don't have to confront anything more. They can just go, collect themselves, sit in Foundation Hall, and have a contemplative, reflective moment. We thought about that all the way along. So now we're operating a facility that's bringing in anywhere from in low season, 5,000 people a day, to right now about 11 to 12,000 people a day on average, sometimes as much as 14,000 people a day. And you know, our visitor services people are like, you know, we need to have a visitor service station right here to help people navigate what is actually a very confusing space. And you know, those of us who were so close to the design are like, well, you can't put a podium there. You know, that's part of the experience of the space, and yet the demands of operating the museum are such that we have to figure out how to accommodate that. And in a space that is so emotionally charged, where every element from the way you go down, the materials used on that ramp getting you downstairs, to the materials used on the volumes, which are the underside of the memorial pools that actually penetrate into the physical space of the museum below ground and literally float above the actual foundation slabs of the Twin Towers. The materials selected for that, we were very self-conscious about what that would be, what it would mean, how it would work in the space, and suddenly you've got a lectern, you know, standing in the middle of this space, and functionally it's absolutely necessary, and conceptually it feels like, how could they do that to the design of the museum? And so those kinds of tensions are beginning now to surface, and it's a really interesting thing to have to navigate the lived experience of a place that you've imagined for so long and that has a kind of integrity in the design and the delivery and the language that is coherent, and then suddenly, and here I'll end with this example because it's very telling, you know, when we were in the last stages of planning the spaces of the museum, we always plan for a museum store. You need a store to have part of your earned revenue. This is a museum that does not have any public support. We're hoping to get it, but we don't have any now. So we depend on earned revenue and raising funds to operate. So having a retail operation was essential. There was an outcry from a group of family members who, not ever having seen the plans, envisioned that this store would be the first thing you'd see going into the museum. And how dare we commercialize the final resting place of their loved ones. And there was a big to-do over this in the New York Post, or the Daily News, I can't remember which, but one of them. And you know, we worked very hard in response to that concern to make the museum store quite discreet. It's set back. We have an angled entryway so that you actually can't see into it. There's a sign that says museum store, but you can't see into it. You must go in to look at the merchandise. So it's very discreet, it's very low key. Well, guess what? Okay, operations is furious now because not enough people are going into the store because they can't find it. Okay, so now we need a sign as you're coming up from Bedrock, you know, up this escalator, you've just had this sometimes 3.5, 4-hour experience. You're very emotional at that moment, you know. We try to bring people out of the trauma of 9/11 into a moment of uplift and honestly positive feeling, hopefulness. You come up this escalator and right in front of you is museum store this way. Okay, totally breaks the mood, right? So how do you negotiate those equally legitimate needs of an institution, the visitor experience, the need to operate and support the museum? It's a tough one. So, you know, that's what's on my mind. Happy to take some questions.
Quería preguntarle de qué postura piensa que está más cerca el memorial, de una revisión crítica de la historia o de una demostración de poderío. ¿Cómo piensa que el memorial sana de alguna manera esta gran herida, ¿no? Es una cosa más de demostrar poder y resurgir, o una revisión más crítica?
Everybody's heard the question in whatever language? Okay, that's a great question, honestly. First of all, the museum probably, if you think of sort of key messages that people would take away from their experience at the museum, the first is that acts of terrorism are indefensible. Absolutely, fundamentally indefensible. Whatever the grievance is, political or otherwise, whatever the legitimacy of the grievance is, if it is legitimate, killing 2,977 people who all they did that day was go to work or get on an airplane to go to Disneyland. There was a family going to Disneyland, or to go to a meeting on the West Coast, or to move to Australia, doing what all of us do in our lives on any given day. Unacceptable. Absolutely, that's the place we start. Unacceptable response to grievance. We live in a world that is completely interdependent on every possible level. We are interdependent economically. Look what happened last week with China, okay? Interdependent in terms of environment. You know, the North Pole is shrinking. That affects the weather in Buenos Aires. We are interdependent in terms of our health. Somebody comes from Cairo to Los Angeles and West Nile virus comes with them. So the world has shrunk in such a way that our interdependencies require that we figure out how to share this planet together in ways that do not involve mass murder, because mass murder is not a solution. And that's the premise that we start with. The other message that comes out of a visit to this museum is, and we tell the story, we tell you what happened on 9/11, but we're not telling you that it means something. You know, we're not in the telling you what 9/11 means business. We're not the museum of the promotion of values of freedom. That's not what we're doing, although certainly we support values of freedom. Our position is that we're here to attest to what happened, because if you don't attest to what happened, you can't begin to understand it. You need to understand what happened that day. And as I was saying to somebody earlier in our conference, you know, we're at the 14th anniversary of 9/11. There are kids in what we call middle school in the United States, 7th, 8th grade, no lived memory of 9/11. It is past history for those kids. okay? This becomes a place where they have to come because they are inheriting the world defined by this event. And if they don't understand what happened, they can't be constructive in their adult responsibility as citizens of this globalized world. The message that we want people to come out of this experience is that on 9/11 and in the days after 9/11, for a relatively brief period of time, but long enough for us to pay attention, we saw both the worst of human nature. I mean, 9/11 wasn't a tsunami, you know? It wasn't an act of God, much as some of the perpetrators might have wanted you to think so. It was a human decision to fly airplanes like missiles, loaded with jet fuel, into high rises and kill thousands upon thousands of people. So the worst of what we are capable of human beings, we have to face up to that. We need to understand that part of our makeup. But it also was a demonstration of the absolute best of our nature. Over and over and over and over again. I mean, the stories of civilians who wouldn't leave coworkers. There's a wonderful story of a man at Blue Cross Blue Shield in the North Tower who had worked with a friend for years there. They were both in computer programming, and his friend was a quadriplegic in a wheelchair. And Abe would not leave the side of Ed in the wheelchair, and he, wouldn't go downstairs himself. He waited, and a firefighter came across them in the stairwell. They got into the stairwell, but they couldn't get down. They were on, I think, the 27th floor, and Billy Burke, this lieutenant from Engine 21, says to Abe, "Let's carry him down." And they got down several flights carrying this man in his wheelchair, and they stopped to catch their breaths. They called home. Abe's family called Ed's family to say that they were safe. They were with a firefighter. Billy called his girlfriend, and she has just seen the South Tower collapse on television, and she is screaming at him to get out of that tower. Run for his life. The tower's already beginning to look like it's leaning. And he says to her, "This is my job. This is who I am." He's the only member of his company to die on 9/11. Okay. So here you have a first response heroism story, a civilian heroism story. In the days that followed, the number of people who ran to ground zero from literally all over the world to say, we need to do something, what can we do? From, I love this story, Artie Gudjon, he's a podiatrist in New York City, and he saw that these recovery workers, the soles of their shoes were melting because of the heat of the pile. It was still burned for months. And they were on their feet all day, initially trying to do rescues, and of course that after the 12th, that was not even a possibility, but to try to recover remains for the families. And Artie came for a day to give foot massages at St. Paul's Chapel, where there was a kind of relief center to, the guys could take off their shoes, rest their legs a little bit. He gave them foot massages. He was a podiatrist. He stayed 9 months at Ground Zero. Okay, he stopped his practice for 9 months to help these guys. That's just one story out of hundreds. And to my mind, that's the story. It's 9/12 as much as it is 9/11 at this museum. And it's remembering that it's a choice that we have as human beings. In a moment like that, you can run for your life, you can stay with your friend, you can run down to Ground Zero, you can do any number of things. You can decide, I'll tell you one more story because it's actually my favorite in the museum. It's in our power to make the world the way we want it. It's not in anybody else's power. Bad things are going to happen. This museum is not going to prevent terrorism. We don't assume that we can. There are people with bad intent, and if they have the means and the methods, they will do harm. This has been human nature forever. But what's in our power is how we respond, and that changes the world. So Ada Dolch was a principal of the High School for Leadership and Public Service in Lower Manhattan. It's still there. It's about 2 blocks south of the World Trade Center on Church Street. On 9/11, some of you may remember, it was the mayoral primary in the city of New York. So her school was not only that Tuesday in its second day of school for that academic year, so kids were still coming in going, where's homeroom? And she's in the lobby with her walkie-talkie saying, go up to 612. But it was also a polling place for the neighborhood. So people were coming in, they were voting, they were leaving. So at 8:46, she's in the lobby directing kids to homeroom, and a student rushes in and says, Mrs. Dolch, a plane just hit the World Trade Center, the North Tower of the World Trade Center. And he's obviously frantic and hysterical. And she's calming him down, and she says, first responders are gonna be here, they're gonna come, they're gonna do what they do, it's gonna be all right. She sends him upstairs. New York high schools, by the way, are vertical, they're not horizontal. So everybody goes upstairs. And within a few minutes, she is beginning to get alerts from security upstairs. And security is telling her the kids are leaning out the windows, looking at things they shouldn't see. It's terrible. People are jumping out of skyscrapers. And the children are watching this happen, and it's horrible. They're crying, they're hysterical. What are we going to do? Should we close school? And she looks around and she says, I can't close school. I've got the neighbors here. I've got, second day of school. Get them away from the window. We're going to have to try to figure this out. She's trying to figure it out. Second plane hits, and she goes into overdrive. She shuts the polls. She sends the neighbors home. She gathers over 600 students and faculty, and she has to think on her feet because their normal mustering place in an emergency is where? The World Trade Center. She can't go there. So she has to figure, where am I taking 600 students? She goes all the way down to Battery Park. At that point, the subways are still running. She gets the kids dispersed. She makes sure everybody has a buddy. Everybody gets home safely. The entire time she is being the consummate professional. Really, all she could think about was her sister, who worked in the North Tower at Cantor Fitzgerald. And needless to say, her sister, Wendy, did not survive on 9/11. So how does Ada Dolch, an educator, principal of a school, high school, choose to commemorate the life of her sister? We have a picture in the museum at the end of the historical exhibition. It's a picture of Ada in a headscarf at the school in Herat, Afghanistan, that she built in her sister's name. So the Wendy Rosario School, and she's surrounded by the students, okay? She figured out a way to build a school in Afghanistan to commemorate the life of her sister. I can't think of a better example of what each of us has the potential to do. She's a principal. She doesn't have a gazillion dollars. She doesn't make any money in New York City school system. She figured out a way. She hooked up with a group in California. They do this sort of thing. She knew what she wanted to do, and that was a constructive response to evil. That's what I think the museum is about.
Sí, yo quería preguntar, bueno, entiendo por la exposición, acá estoy. Entiendo por la exposición que hay la intención de entender qué pasó, no solamente concentrarse en el día, sino esta búsqueda por ver la poesía de los perpetradores, por ver su visión del mundo, lo que estaba pasando. Pero, ¿qué posibilidades hay para un museo que está donde está y que, bueno, fue construido a la luz de lo que ocurrió, de pensar la otra parte de la historia, la parte de lo que la propia política norteamericana tuvo que ver con ese hecho, no solo pensarlo como un hecho total? ¿Qué posibilidades tuvieron o no para pensar autocríticamente? Creo que este ejemplo de la profesora, bueno, ahí hay una visión autocrítica y decir, bueno, ¿de qué manera construyo algo? Pero como museo, ¿qué posibilidades hubo de hacerlo?
Absolutely. Okay, so it's a great question again. The museum presents, we have the second part of the historical exhibition after you have gone through the events of the day. We present basically we ask the question, how was the World Trade Center the target of terrorism, not just once, but twice? What did it mean to others? What does it mean to us? And we talk about the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center, which was not Al-Qaeda. It was not perpetrated by Al-Qaeda. It was an offshoot of an Egyptian sheikh. But that group was espousing a similar ideology as Al-Qaeda. And then we bring you into, well, how do you get from 1993 to 2001? And we introduce the rise of Al-Qaeda in the context of its emergence in the Soviet-Afghan War. We talk about the fact that the United States, Soviet Union was our enemy in 1979. So we were really very happy, the CIA was very happy to be supporting the insurgents. Among those insurgents was a Saudi by the name of Osama bin Laden, who had in his mind that, you know, this was a jihad and he was going to prove it to the world. We tell that story. We talk about that. We talk about what the United States knew of Al-Qaeda's activities. President Clinton, Bill Clinton, had an opportunity to bomb some of the training sites in Afghanistan and chose not to for various reasons, good or bad. But we were aware of this organization. They were not new to anybody. In fact, George Tenet, within seconds of hearing about the attack in New York, before the Pentagon was hit, said it's Al-Qaeda, it's bin Laden. They knew. We don't, you know, our job is not to wrap the history. Our job is to tell the history. Okay, we're not going to put a spin on it. We're not going to say this is what it means. We're going to say, oh, you know, in 1999, Bill Clinton knew about that. Oh, George Tenet was aware. We allow the visitor to put the pieces together in a way that nobody was actually connecting the dots prior to 9/11. We can connect the dots retrospectively now. That's a form of education and literacy about this historic event. You know, we struggled with how do you deal with Afghanistan and Iraq, the war on terror. You know, we talk about it. We talk about it. We talk about the fact that many young people enlisted in response to 9/11 because they wanted to defend their country. And they ended up in Iraq fighting essentially a different enemy. We try to stay current. You know, one of our big questions was, where do you end your story? 9/11 isn't over in any way. It's not. ISIS is, I use the term, it's a metastasis of Al-Qaeda. We are dealing with the consequences of our reactions to 9/11. And it's ongoing. So the museum, I mean, one of the great challenges, how do you have a museum? Museums codify information. It becomes solid when you make an exhibition, even a digital exhibition. How do you stay on top of your story if it isn't over yet? And that's one of the things we're trying to figure out with our programming and with, you know, we have something called a timescape that tracks news stories every day that come out of this event. I think we're done. Thank you so much.